Welcome to Click for IB Biology. Here we are looking at the mechanism of natural selection as proposed by Charles Darwin in his 1859 publication, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. There's a blank version of my presentation, a PDF down in the description. You can download that and annotate with your own notes, and then when complete, take the 10-question quiz to test your understanding and secure that understanding by checking out the answers, which are also supplied. So let's look at the mechanism for natural selection. There are in fact a number of misconceptions regarding evolution and natural selection. Let me deal with the two most common. The first one is that Darwin proposed evolution. This is not the case. What Darwin proposed was a mechanism by which evolution could occur, and of course we know that today as natural selection. The second point to be clarified is that natural selection is not a random process. Let's take a look at that point in particular. The genetic variation which underlies any population is created randomly. The types of genetic variation that we might consider have already been highlighted and detailed both in the previous video and of course in your study of genetics. But the variation within the population is the genetic variation within the population is randomly created. The second component of Darwin's natural selection model is of overpopulation. Darwin noted, and was particularly influenced by reading of Thomas Malthus, that populations tend to overproduce. That is to say that they produce more individuals than is required simply to replace others where there is mortality. Now, this additional population, overpopulation as is described, naturally leads, therefore, to a competition for limited resources. This is a concept that you may be more familiar with in our study of ecology. The competition, which I described, leads in turn to the third component, which is that of selection. Selection is not a random process. The survival of individuals within a population is not a random process, but is a consequence of, as Darwin would describe it, their struggle for existence. This struggle for existence takes the form of intraspecific competition, predation, herbivory, parasitism, and other forms of disease. The struggle for existence may also take the form of resisting radical changes which may be caused by abiotic factors. And so the selection, which is the survival of the fittest, as it was later known, so survival of the fittest, was referring to the survival of individuals. This leads us to our fourth component, the survival of individuals so that they could successfully reproduce. And indeed, this is, in fact, our biological definition of reproductive or evolutionary fitness, is the capacity to survive environmental pressures and stresses to successfully reproduce. Characteristics that an organism has which allows this are selected, allows their selection, and they will be selected and be represented in the next generation. And that in fact leads us to our fifth component, that where we have selection of a component of genetic variation which allows the individual to become successful in their reproduction, that characteristic, where it is genetically inherited, will result in a change in allele frequencies, and a change in allele frequencies over time. And finally, by incorporating that idea together, the change in allele frequencies over time is one of the well-known definitions of evolution itself. Notice that where we have characteristics which allow successful reproduction, which therefore results in a change in the allele frequency, these allele frequencies will therefore be more frequent in the next generation. That variation then becomes the next background against which selection will continue to operate in what is essentially a positive feedback loop, enhancing that characteristic. Let's take a look at an applied example. The example that we're going to look at is of the fish known as guppies, and this example is selected as later on we'll be considering John Endler's work on guppy biology from Trinidad and Tobago. Within the population here, what I'm suggesting is a distribution curve of the variance within the population. And for this particular case, we're considering the size of fish. In the distribution of this characteristic, my curve, my distribution model here, is suggesting that the very smallest fish are not frequent, not common, and the very biggest of the fish are also not common. But that medium-sized fish would occupy this central area here and be more frequent. So we have our genetic variation. With the overpopulation of our guppy population, therefore they now present, we need to introduce the selection factor, and this is predation. Predation coming about by a predatory fish. And so we have a biotic factor of predation, which will be operating on the variation that we see here in the population. In John Endler's work, what he noticed was that where a predator is present, the colourful and largest fish were selected again. So we're going to remove those from the population, like so. So this section of the variation is selected against. This leaves smaller fish as our survivors, and they will then form the population, which we will then describe as being successfully reproductive. The alleles for smallness will increase. If the predation continues, the distribution curve in fact will be shifted from the previous position towards the left, with the smaller fish becoming more and more frequent within the population. This change in the allele frequency for size is an example of evolution in action. Endler's work goes on to consider the influence of colour and the availability or not of predators, and that is covered in other later examples. In the analysis of any type of natural selection, students are advised to systematically look for the genetic variation, invoke the idea of overpopulation and competition for limited resources, identify the selection factor, identify the successful individuals in reproduction, that is to say, they have greater fitness, and then determine which alleles may in fact be increasing in frequency. And by doing so, you will have identified the process of evolution. And just to recap, remember that the genetic variation is the random component, but selection is not random. The next video in this sequence is now appearing in a link before us. There's a chance to subscribe to the channel here as well, and of course our entire playlist including standard and higher level videos for IB biology.